everyone. Okay, the mic's not on. Check. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Marbun. I'll be the moderator for today. Thank you very much for joining us here. We would have an interesting talk today, and that will be based on a study made by the World Bank titled Resurgent East Asia, Navigating a Changing World. So we'll have excellent speakers with us here today talking about what it took for East Asia to become what it is now. And we've seen great news from East Asia when we're talking about the economy and the growth of the economy. To be honest, I thought that when we were talking about Resurgent of East Asia, we'll be talking about K-pop a little bit. But that's not the matter, apparently. So anyway, we'll be talking about the economy and what we have faced here. Because East Asia we have a lot that we can learn about East Asia. And this is basically also including some ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and also Thailand, of course. And of course, the other East Asian countries and China. So we'll see what we can gain from this study done by Andrew D. Mason. Sudhir Shetty is here. Please give a round of applause to Mr. Shetty here. He's right in front. I don't know why you're not going to sit with us here. These are all your findings, but apparently you have everyone here. But it's great names that we have here. Now, before we can start our talks today, I would like to invite to open our event this afternoon, the Finance Minister of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Please welcome Ibu Sri Mulyani. You do realize I will have to kindly request you to clap again once Sri Mulyani enters, but not yet, not yet, not yet. Let's just hold it there for a moment. A very busy woman, of course. It's the World Bank IMF meeting. You could expect anything less. You could not expect anything less from Ibu Sri Mulyani. But anyway, as you see, I would like to address Your Excellency, Minister of Finance from Malaysia. Please give a round of applause to Pak Lim. Mr. Lim, thank you very much for joining us today. Malaysia, and also we have a representative from Vietnam, an academician from Vietnam, a researcher, who can talk about what Vietnam is enjoying now and also facing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Excellency, Ibu Sri Mulyani, thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to invite you for the opening remarks. I'll give you a minute to sit down for a moment. I know how much you've walked and stand for today. Thank you very much, Ibu Sri, for coming with us today or for being here. Interesting talks about East Asia. So for your opening remarks, please welcome Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati.
Thank you very much for inviting me for the regional seminar on the Resurgence East Asia, how we can adapt its development model to a changing world. I think this is a very timely and maybe a very interesting discussion on the issue. But before I proceed, I would like to welcome you all here in Bali, and I do hope that you have a very productive visit here in Bali. Don't forget to enjoy the beach, and also don't forget to spend your dollar here. That's going to be good for our economy. First of all, as a region, East Asia has been an engine of global growth and a beacon of stability. In the last few decades, this region has achieved in its economic development, and it's quite extraordinary. This era has been associated with East Asia development model that also known as growth with equity, especially driven by economic openness, investment in human capital, and building an effective governance. East Asia grew twice as fast as the rest of Asia, and also 3 times faster than Latin America and South Asia, and East Asia growth is 5 times than Sub-Saharan Africa. So definitely the East Asia region outperformed not only other region, but also industrial economy and the Middle East, North Africa region. At the same time, this astonishing growth performance also followed by a success in declining poverty in almost all countries. No other region, and I repeat, no other region has been able to lift so many people out of poverty in such a very short span of time. So East Asia potential is still huge despite the achievements so far, and its aspiration to upgrade its status as high-income countries remain strong. But to achieve that aspiration and to unleash its potential, full potential, the region faces headwinds coming from various factors. For example, China economic growth moderation, aging population for some countries, and the fundamental change in global economic environment that often leads to uncertainty. So the clock is ticking, and there is not much time left for East Asian countries to avoid the middle income trap. This region has to step up its transformation. And I'm grateful that World Bank has launched this report entitled A Resurgent East Asia, and also hosts this seminar. I hope that the report really useful to many of us. The ideas and recommendations that will come up from this event will help East Asia in maintaining its role as a driver of the global growth and achieve its aspiration to be more prosperous. I really hope that that's really can be used that way. That means that it is going to help all of us to maintain our role as a driver of global growth. But before we proceed, I would like to share our views on how East Asia can continue to thrive against the backdrop of challenging global environment and changes in the region itself. I believe the key is in continuous reform. That is the easiest way to say. But it's going to be very hard and getting harder to do. Before elaborating more on the reform East Asia can take, let me share some views regarding the development and challenges this region is currently facing. It is undeniable that East Asia phenomenal growth has been nurtured by several economic and political factors, such as a policy to promote labor-intensive growth that integrates with the global economy, policies to build up investment in basic human capital, such as primary education, health and nutrition, and most importantly, policy that provide more and more support for the population to be more productive. The economic growth, which is fast-paced, also accompanied by reduction in the poverty, and without increasing significantly inequality. This is really a very, very important achievement if you compare with many other regions in the world. My own experience, sometimes we are less grateful with our own achievement. And this is a good feeling, because meaning that we want to do better and more, despite that actually what we achieve is quite remarkable. The region is still an important engine of global growth. China and Indonesia, for instance, are among countries with the highest growth rate in the G20. Moreover, the East Asia region has shown its resilience during the global financial crisis, 2008-2009. Despite the challenge on the global trade, this region still maintains its role in international trade. China alone is contributing up to 12.8% of total global export and 10.2% of total import. One of the key successes of East Asia is the rapid industrialization in various countries. Currently, we have also witnessed the emergence of new manufacturing hubs, such as Vietnam or Cambodia. For me personally, this is really a remarkable development because I really follow and work very closely with many other colleagues, finance minister in ASEAN. Just 12 years ago, when I was finance minister back then, the discussion is not really that upbeat for countries like even Vietnam and Cambodia. But today, they become one of the most promising emergence of the manufacturing hub. Remarkable change only within a decade. Incredible growth in the services industry also has been seen in large economies such as China or even Indonesia. Nevertheless, East Asia countries should continue to drive industrialization. For my own country, Indonesia, this issue is really dear to our heart. We struggle, we discuss, many of actually have a high hope, some disappointed with the pace of industrialization and the design of industrialization. So we, Indonesia, can and will learn a lot from our own policy in the past, current, as well as learn from others on how we can shape in the future. The key ingredient that lifts the country up to the middle income country is the transformation of the economy from primarily dominated by the primary sector into a more manufacturing base. So in reviving industry and avoid premature deindustrialization, innovation that are supported by research and development will play a critical role. And this is really the core of many discussions that we here in Indonesia is having. Going further, the fastest pace of global growth trajectory will remain concentrated in India, China, and ASEAN countries. Many institutions have predicted that the global economic power in the near future will shift to the emerging economies. And some of them are East Asia countries, such as China, Indonesia, or ASEAN in general. The question is, are we really truly could make this prediction happen, and have we prepared enough to get there? Those questions should be well anchored in our mind. So what is the challenge faced by East Asia? Despite all those achievements that I mentioned, East Asia still faces challenges nowadays that have been there for quite some time and have not found the best solution, although some progress here and there, but I think we feel that the solution is not really comprehensive. This includes addressing continued poverty, although I think for Indonesia, we reached a historical point in which the first time in the history of Indonesia, our poverty rate now in the one single digit level, below 10%. This is historical, but still at 9.8. We could and we should do better. Also, in the issue of inequality, the issue of institution and governance, issue of climate change, and another issue which is very close to Indonesia's own priority, that is infrastructure. Reducing poverty in the region remains an unfinished agenda. Even in countries with relatively high per capita income, and in several East Asia countries, not only poverty but income inequality has risen as economic inclusiveness has not achieved yet. Institution and governance issues, including poor public services, weak government institutions, and corruption, remain a challenge across the region. Furthermore, East Asia has experienced a significant increase in the number, intensity, and impact of extreme weather events such as a tropical cyclone, flood, drought, and heat wave in the last several years. So infrastructure inefficiency have also restrained our economic growth. In addition to that, the downside risks also give doubt about the possibility of East Asia to repeat its illustrious era in the future. There are several factors that affect the growth prospect in East Asia that are often discussed. First, the China rebalancing, how it impacts own China economy, but also regionally and globally. Aging population, and the most recent and becoming really a headline every day is trade war and trade protection. Don't forget that all the success of the East Asia economy in the past 3 decades was because there is an open trade and globalization that benefiting almost all countries in East Asia. So first, on a China rebalancing that will affect not only the global outlook, but also East Asia outlook, because it contributes, the China economy contributes to the global growth significantly. The shift of the China economic model from the export investment-driven economy into more domestic demand will have a spillover to the region, especially in the context of trade and financial sector. On an aging population, this will also have another challenge for several countries. Deloitte predicts that Asia will be home to over 60% of the total population aged 65 years or older worldwide by 2030s. Indonesia maybe relatively have a young demographic, but we are not the largest country in East Asia. On global trade, which has become the headline and the focus of many discussions today, this is an important driver for growth in Asia, and it is now being threatened by the protectionism. Protectionism will incur significant costs for investment, job, and living standard in Asia. Another aspect, technological advancement that brought both positive benefit but also creating a negative impact for the economy and the people. Technology can be used to solve global issues, including increasing growth and increasing productivity, improving global health, and reducing the impact of climate change. But technology can also create disruption. Disruption in society, particularly in labor market. And to be honest, almost all countries in the world has not yet prepared on how to respond to this possibility. But a lot of policy discussion has been ongoing. So at least we recognize it is coming and we need to prepare. The equity growth model that focuses on economic openness human capital, and good, effective governance has successfully helped East Asia grow in the last few decades. We become even what we call it Asia miracle. The Asia is always the most important and the most vibrant region in the world. But given the current challenges, we have to think in a more innovative way. What should be the next set of policy and action to become a high-income country? So what is going to be the future strategy for East Asia? To tackle those challenges, we should pursue a more positive course. This means we have to optimize the benefit of globalization and technology. We need to ensure the international framework and multilateral system work for everyone to provide a level playing field that avoid protectionist measure and distortive policy. I think what is the lesson learned very valuable on this current episode is that we are too upbeat and only focus on the winner. We always expect and believe that the loser will adjust themselves. They actually can then learn and change and become part of the winner. I think what we see in the most advanced country, including the largest economy in the world, like United States, that attitude is not happening, or that belief is not true. So we must, on the one hand, avoid policy that create spillover, unexpected negative spillover that can increase tension between countries and erode the economic integration in East Asia. But we also have to be able to learn why the political support of globalization and openness is eroding. East Asia countries should stand together to deliver our aspiration for the better global economic environment. And if we doing it in the position of strength on our economic situation, we have more possibility to succeed. Trade will flourish, business confidence is upheld, the openness can be maintained, but we provide more policy measures to address those who potentially left behind. This is the most important message for the East Asia country. And if East Asia country can address those issues, I'm sure we are going to be able to inspire other regions and globally. We, in promoting more social inclusiveness while opening the economy, we have to make sure that the social protection policy is effective and well targeted. This will not only reduce inequality, but most importantly, will provide support for those losers and left behind to catch up. Not only that openness and trade has become a threat for those who cannot compete or cannot enjoy the benefit. Technological change is also providing opportunity, but also threat. So how technological progress can be utilized to improve inclusiveness in many emerging countries is going to be very critical. Indonesia, we also witnessing a vibrant role being played by digital technology toward a new pathway to prosperity. This is done by connecting the informal sector to the formal economy. In common with many developing countries, over half of our working population is engaged in agricultural or informal work. piecing together a livelihood from a range of activities that are largely unregulated, untaxed, and unprotected. The boom in digital money transfer and transport platforms, such as motorbike taxi hailing platform like Gojek, has allowed millions of people to improve their livelihood. As you all maybe recognize, Gojek, founded by a young, bright Indonesia, Nadima Karim, now link more than 1 million riders and over 20 million monthly users in Indonesia. It is not only that the magnitude of how they connect, but the inspiration coming from how technology can connect those which is not connected before, or those who can get a much better, efficient, reliable transaction, creating a society based on trust is just remarkable. So technology definitely can help, and we should really design this in a way that can strengthen the inclusiveness of our economic development strategy. Another force that can be optimized by emerging economy and East Asia region is by enabling women participation in the workforce. Indonesia is lagged behind on that, but this is not exception. According to ADB, currently less than half of women in Asia are in the workforce compared with 80% for men. For the women who do work, they also receive salary or paid almost 25% less than their male counterpart. The International Labour Organization found that positions of leadership in the economy, the top management job, are occupied by women in only 1 in 3 cases. So if nothing is done, the cause of this left behind or less inclusive will be extensive for the economy in East Asia and globally. This is estimated around 4.5 trillion in annual GDP by 2025, according to McKinsey. So in closing, we all know that capitalizing and using the technological progress will provide us with possible innovative solutions on how East Asia can continue become a region who can showcasing that integrating with the global economy, maintaining openness, and designing more inclusive growth will create better relation. It is not only good for ASEAN, but also for the world. I hope through all can exchange idea and insight that can help this its remarkable development and position in the world. Need example as of today, the world need inspiration, and East Asia can and should become one of the regions that can provide those example and inspiration. The 21st century is going to be the century for East Asia. I know that the future path is not going to be easy, and this is not only economic issue. The political security and the balancing of power at the geopolitical side is going to be very, very critical. So let us all here is become the voice to say to the world that we have achieved so far a progress which is remarkable for the humankind in the world. Let this progress be maintained and spread to the world by all of us to be able to maintain what is the good side of the policy achievement in the past and to correct effectively and fast enough of all the failure, of all the success that we've already achieved. I look forward of having a fruitful exchange of view with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I don't think my mic is on yet, so I'll be using the podium. Thank you very much, Minister of Finance, the Republic of Indonesia, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, for joining us and giving the opening remarks for our event today. We will continue with the panelists today. I would like to invite all panelists here. I would like to introduce them each. First, he is a first-time Minister of Finance in the new Pakatan Harapan government led by the Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. He is a well-known politician serving as the Secretary General of the Democratic Action Party since 2004. He has also served as Chief Minister for the state of Penang from 2008 until 2018. And he is the son of Lim Kit Siang, a longtime leader of the opposition from 1973 to 1999. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Minister of Finance for Malaysia, Lim Guan Eng. Next, I would like to invite a senior fellow at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, professor of international economics at the University of Indonesia, board member of Indonesia Bureau of Economic Research, currently serves as a number of boards such as the Leadership Council of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN. Bu Mari, could I please cut through this very long CV? Please welcome Ibu Mari Elkapangesu. She also held 3 ministerial positions in Indonesia. She was the Minister of Trade, Tourism, and also for small medium enterprises. Thank you very much, Bu Mari. A very long CV, very impressive, of course. I would like to invite the Managing Director of the Growth Dialogue and Professor of International Business at George Washington University. He is a former World Bank Vice President for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management, and he was Vice Chair of the Spence Commission on Growth and Development. He is also a peer reviewer for the study that has been done that we will be talking about today. Please welcome Danny Libziger. And next is a senior lecturer in public policy from Fulbright University, Vietnam. He has 20 years of experience in teaching, designing, and implementing development policies in finance and public investment. He also teaches in the Master in Public Policy program, the first public policy degree program offered in Vietnam. Please welcome Nguyen Xuan Tan. Thank you very much, all panelists, for joining me today, and thank you everyone for being here. We will be talking about a resurgent of East Asia, and as I said, that one of the peer reviewers is Danny Libziger. So Danny, as we heard from Ibu Sri Mulyani, that East Asia has been one of the strongest drives in the global economic growth. However, there are very visible and challenges and very difficult challenges, and may I say unexpected challenges later on, unpredicted or hard to predict challenges. From what we read here, a resurgence of East Asia, of course, not everyone has received this. Could you please touch on which points that you think we should put heavy focus on?
Yes, I will.
Yeah, it's on.
So I think this is a very important report because I think it's very clear in its diagnostics. And I think the diagnostics are that even though the region has done fantastically well, as the minister pointed out, there are a number of challenges out there, some external and some internal. The external challenges dependent on export-led growth is economy having to do with trade, global value chains, etc., which will make that path a little bit more difficult in the future than it was in the past. I think the minister mentioned disruptive technologies, which have great benefits, but also entail some adjustments. I think that's another external challenge. I think a third has to do with the role of China, which she also mentioned, because China is in a position where it is rebalancing, restructuring, and repositioning itself, and that has major implications, not only globally, but particularly for this part of the world. And then we have trade wars, which is a current phenomenon that we may want to address. So that's on the external side. On the internal side, I think the report makes it pretty clear that there are rising expectations of the middle class in this part of the world, that this comes at a time when there is some increase in inequality and probably some greater concentration of wealth, and that governments are going to have some greater difficulties in dealing with some of these challenges internally, because there's a bit of a slowdown in terms of productivity, largely due to the service sector. There are some questions about the innovation model that will be pursued going forward. And so there are a number of factors, both on the internal and the external side, that countries and governments need to be aware of and need to plan for. So this is a region of the world that has done extremely well in thinking ahead. But we're now in a world in which not only do you have to think ahead, but you have to think ahead in an environment of greater uncertainty. And that makes it quite difficult for governments. And so I think the report is very helpfully directing governments in this part of the world to think ahead and to perhaps think of a slightly different role for the state. The state is not just there to level the playing field and allow exports to expand. It's also needing to cover transitions in terms of disruptive technology, which will cost some jobs in some sectors, and has to do with aging, as the minister mentioned, and has to deal with inequality. So if you take these three factors, aging, inequality, and disruptive technology, what binds them together, in my mind, is that they all require fiscal expenditures. And my last point, and the most remarkable part of this report, the one that surprised me the most, was that even though East Asia is a leader among regions in many, many areas, it is not a leader when it comes to revenue mobilization. The state is not collecting enough money to deal with these future challenges like the ones that I mentioned.
All right, thanks, Dan. Now, just to remind all of you that if you want your colleagues or anyone to watch this, we do stream online. It's at live.worldbank.org, live.worldbank.org. Now, I'd like to pick everyone's mind. You all are familiar about East Asia and what has been happening in this region, of course, regarding the growth of the economy. What are your personal findings, as of course, in your own respective positions, that you have been learning from East Asia, and also, of course, being part of it, and the challenges according to each one of you? I would go to Bumari first.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts in this panel. It's quite freezing in here, so we're not doing too much for climate change, I think.
The U.S. report says so.
Observation. I would like to just pick on the trade issue, just because I think the East Asian miracle story that, I was also part of this World Bank study back in the 90s on the East Asian miracle, is predicated on, openness, trade and investment, export-oriented model, and within that, the rise of China when it acceded to join the WTO. And all the unilateral reforms that happened were actually framed in the regional and multilateral commitment. And you had growth, you had reduction in poverty, as we heard from the minister, but inequality actually went up, right? It went up even in Indonesia and has not been able to come down recently. So that's a big issue in terms of the new challenges and realities that we are facing, including what's happening in advanced countries, this rise in protectionism, and the notion that globalization, trade has not benefited everyone. Just as the minister said, we didn't think too much about the losers, and that it's the losers who are now affecting elections and economic policy to go more inward, right? So that's, I think, also a challenge for East Asia, even though the causes are different, of course. But dealing with sharing the benefits, if you want to go further in opening up, then you do have to address that issue. And I think the issue of declining or slowing down in productivity, which is raised in this report, and outlining that it is affected by what Danny mentioned about the more challenging external environment that we are facing, where the observation since the global financial crisis is that trade growth has slowed down. At one point, it was actually lower than income growth, whereas before the global financial crisis, it was like growing twice that of income growth. Now it's growing maybe at the same rate as income growth. And then you have to ask the reason, is it structural or is it cyclical? And I think some of the studies in here, as well as your other studies, have shown that it's several reasons: maturation of the global value chain, increased protectionism, and the fact that we haven't addressed many of the other aspects of globalization, such as services. So I think that's kind of the challenge that we have if we're asking the question, where should East Asia go henceforth? And this includes, of course, from the perspective of a country like Indonesia. So what should we be doing now, moving forward? I'd like to just say, I think we need a three-pronged approach. And I would start where the minister emphasized. We have to start, at the end of the day, it is about unilateral reforms. And where would you put your unilateral reforms? And I think she said it quite well, that we need, trade will still have to be the engine of growth moving forward. We hope that it's not going to be everybody going to be looking inward, import substitution, made in China, made in America, make America great kind of policy. That's not the way to go. The opportunities for trade to be contributing to growth and productivity is still tremendous, especially the fact that not just in goods, we know there's a lot of maturation of the global value chain, but services, trade in services, I think, has to be the way forward. And how do you become more competitive in services? Because if you look at it, just Indonesia as an example, the growth is in the services sector. Even the growth of the labor absorption is in the services sector. But it is like what I call services sector as the employer of the last resort, because it's going to the traditional low-end services like construction, like trade. What we should be doing is doing more reform on services so that we can be more competitive in services, develop our modern services so that you are going to be creating jobs, not just in goods. And at the same time, you will be addressing the competitiveness issue for your manufacturing sector. And the sectors that are a lot of countries, maybe with the exception of Malaysia and Thailand, education and health are fairly closed in countries like Indonesia, whereas that's where you want to put some attention to because of the human capital.
You're not saying that just because the minister's here, right?
No.
Okay.
But I think they have kind of, we look at what they're doing and, like medical tourism and so on, because I was tourism minister. So I think investment is the other part of the story also. So the reforms need to address making sure that your investment climate, you're continuing to address the investment issue so that you are getting the quality investments to come in, including sustainable infrastructure type of investments, and so on and so forth. I think we can have a long list of reforms, but within those reforms, I think going back to the kind of challenge of dealing with increased protectionist trend and the feeling of the losers not getting the benefit, the effectiveness of adjustment policy, social safety net, education and training, I think that's really one of the big challenges. So the other two prongs, I'll just say very briefly, would be to what is the role of East Asia to make sure that the process of openness continues. And that leads to the regional trade agreements that we are already in, which in this report it says it's rather shallow. Rather shallow means it's basically WTO, slightly WTO plus. But it is not deep like the CPTPP. I think maybe as kind of two rough benchmarks. So we can do more to deepen the regional trade agreements. So while the WTO and while US-China is hopefully going to have some, I don't know what's going to happen there, but at least we can do our part in the region to continue and give a signal that this part of the world is still going to continue opening up, deepening, expanding. And then finally, of course, we cannot escape how to deal with the US-China issue, which is really the big elephant in the room. And if we don't deal with it and if we don't do the reforms that actually pre-Trump, there were a lot of issues in the trade rule book, whether it's dispute settlement, whether it's industrial subsidies, whether it's non-market competition. These are all issues which are not necessarily China-specific, but these are issues that the WTO needs to deal with. So there is an agenda in the WTO and multilateral reforms that East Asia can play a leadership role.
Okay, there should be a more intense talk about that. What is going on between China and America? As you said, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So a lot of here are grass, I guess, so that we should talk more about that. About services also, I'll probably go also later on about the protectionism in services, which is also stated here when actually a lot of East Asian countries, the service sector is a big part of it, including Malaysia as well. If you could see that service is 56.2% compared to industry 36%. But I'd like to know your thought, Minister Lim, about this East Asia resurgence and the problems that you think we'll be facing and what have been done or you will be doing. I want to ask you about your arm. What happened to your arm, your hand?
I would like to say that I'm counting too much money now.
Oh, okay. Okay, Ms. Penny. Okay.
I sprained it anyway.
That's really good to hear. Could you teach us how to do that?
Anyway, thanks for inviting me. No, I believe in a resurgent East Asia, but whether we can maintain our success will depend on our ability, whether we can handle or master both the geography, the demography, and the technology. I want to limit probably my presentation on ASEAN.
Okay.
I do not want to venture too far out.
Okay.
Especially when I'm in my position now, I should be also very careful with what I say. But I think that ASEAN offers an answer to the coming trade war between US and China. You know, in military terms, in security terms, ASEAN is a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. Now that is for security. Why not for trade too? Because we are right in the middle. As I mentioned just now, in geographical terms, we are right in the middle of these two wars. And well, if the trade war is going to happen, even for companies who do not want to be caught between or caught in the middle. Secondly, when we talk about governments and how do we escape the middle income trap. Now my perception always is that somehow when the government tries to do too much, then problems happen. I think it is time that probably we try to get the private sector to take the lead. And that does not mean that the government does not play any role or any part at all. They do in terms of contribution of resources and investments, but that the private sector should also do the same in terms of a matching grant, or matching funds, and then they will run the enterprise so that we can get efficiency gains, we can avoid leakages, and also we can the biggest expense for government is not capex. The biggest expense is invariably OPEX. Because when you cannot ensure the sustainability of the business, then the losses will be incurred in a recurring fashion every year, sometimes for 20 or 30 years. It's just not sustainable. So perhaps a PPP model should be adopted. And a PPP model which involves the public, private, professionals, and the people with public buy-in, where we let the private sector take the lead, especially in technology. Somehow asking the government to take the lead in technology I think is a paradox.
Okay.
What does government knows about technology? And I think the private sector and probably the market would know more about technology. But it doesn't mean that it's determine everything. No. The government should be involved. We should have a say in terms of regulation. But in terms of driving the enterprise, let the private sector take the lead. We come up with matching grants.
A little bit more about that. I would guess that that would be more unpopular to actually leave it to the private sector.
That's why I go to the third point.
Okay.
In terms of unpopularity. The government should focus on improving societal well-being, especially the economic livelihood of the people. Now, when I talk about the economic livelihood of the rakyat, which is the people, it must be in terms, in measurable terms. That means not just in GDP numbers, not just your fiscal deficit, not just in terms of your current account surplus, or whether you are successful in avoiding twin deficits. That excites fund managers and rating agencies. But it has no relevance to the ordinary man in the street. So government should be focused on improving economic well-being in terms of higher real wages and higher purchasing power.
Okay.
What is the point of having very good economic growth numbers if you do not increase the purchasing power of the rakyat, especially the B40?
Okay.
So if the governments can focus on this, let the private sector do what they do best, I think we have a shot at escaping the middle income trap. And also at the same time, at the same time, because this is something that is very personal to me and to Malaysia. At the same time, when you have the private sector there and also the government involved, but has a passive investor keeping an eye, you can avoid leakages and massive corruption on a kleptocratic scale.
Okay.
Which is what Malaysia is now having to overcome. So this is a public-private partnership that perhaps can be a better model than just relying purely on government intervention and government-led expansion.
Do you believe that this model would actually make Malaysia ready for the challenges ahead, especially what we're talking about here, about the technology issues, about how a lot of technology is also reshoring a lot of industry back to China, and especially facing the trade wars and what will come from the trade wars? Do you believe that that will actually be one point to make Malaysia ready?
No, I think in terms of technology, and let me give you an example, Grab car. Grab car originated from Malaysia. But why did they shift to Singapore? Because government was too slow just to give that funding of a miserable $10 million, which was offered by Singapore. Now, if this was done with a PPP model, with a private sector initiative, the private sector can identify the prospective profits. They will inform the government, you better come in quickly. And then we will not lose successful tech startups like that. And I'm sure there are many other examples. And whether this would be unpopular, I think at the end of the day, it's always the results. If you can improve the purchasing power of the rakyat, of the people, you can improve their real wages, I think this is what matters.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Tan, please, your thought on the study today.
I'd like to first touch on an important point in the report about the success comes with significant growth of productivity.
Okay.
And the challenge ahead is actually the slowdown of productivity in a lot of, in the world generally, and especially in East Asia. But from the perspective of a lower middle income country like Cambodia or Vietnam, if you look at the success of productivity increase, it was because of FDI-led manufacturing. It was because of the movement of labor from agriculture sector toward formal manufacturing. It was because of success in the investment in basic education and healthcare. But now if you look at the next stage, and the current structure of these economies that managed to get from low income to lower middle income, it's actually that the stagnation of productivity in a lot of local companies because they are unable to become larger, unable to become suppliers to the FDI companies and many others. So this is the point that the report touched on, is actually, so the policies implemented by a lot of East Asian lower middle income countries has been openness. This has been really beneficial to FDI companies, while a lot of smaller local companies still in accessing land and finance. Become richer, there are also an emergence of various interest groups and monopolies that secure special access to government resources that again stifle competition and stifle the small and medium enterprise sector.
Okay.
So I think from the policy perspective, like the report talk about improvement in competitiveness. And I think special attention should be paid to SMEs. Improving, actually, it's not just the overall economic competitiveness, but I mean with special attention paid to these SMEs. I think that the second point is on the challenge of disruption from technology. Right? So if you look at, Cambodia, Vietnam has been very lucky in terms of attracting the kind of export-oriented, labor-intensive manufacturing. But if you look at the arrival of the fourth industrial revolution, right, a lot of the jobs based on competitive, semi-skilled workers may be gone in the near future.
Okay.
And actually the governments are really struggling to find the response. So currently, like also mentioned in the report, is investment again in education, reskilling, right, the labor force. Right? So the reports talk about higher order cognitive, social, emotion skills that you need to build in the current curriculum, both at lower and secondary education and also vocational and higher education.
Okay.
But the question is, Lim talk about the role of the private sector. Right? Then here already you look at, I mean, a lot of schools in Vietnam, you have the approach of many startup firms that have innovations, introducing new platforms in education, that actually they approach schools in Vietnam and offer that. Right? It's like a new tools of retraining, right, the whole generation. But also from the policy perspective, the schools, right, are very rigid in still following the directions from the central government, from the Ministry of Education. So there's no incentive for them to change. Even though the private sector is ready, you have startup companies offering solutions.
And this is needed.
Yeah.
So I'm going to the tech issue. It could become a threat, and this is the issue from external issue. It could become a threat for technologies to industries, as technology also lets other industries to produce cheaper, especially when we're talking about robotics. And so now, preparing a workforce that is tech savvy, that has received its training and a labor in bigger numbers has been a strength of East Asia. But is this really a threat, or do you think that technology is actually something that we just, could catch up to? It could become a threat, but it can become an opportunity, especially when we're thinking about using that technology in these East Asian countries. Danny?
Well, I think that's at the core of a lot of the sessions here in Bali, which is that disruptive technologies can provide great opportunities
I think you move your mic a bit closer to
leapfrog or to provide government services or to enable the private sector to do what the public sector can't do. So there are a lot of possible advantages, and I think no one doubts that disruptive technologies are coming. I mean, I think if you look at AI, robotics, a whole bunch of areas, it's pretty clear that it's going to hit certain countries earlier than others, but that it's a wave that will be coming. This provides some opportunities, but also some challenges for governments, because in the advanced economies, there's been great difficulty in dealing with dislocations. And the dislocations are going to come more quickly. And on the issue of skills, I think the days where 20 years or 30 years, those days are over. So that means that it's easy to say lifetime learning, etc., but you've got to come up with ways in which workers can be reskilled, and maybe you need individual reskilling accounts. You may need to think more creatively about some of the challenges. And I think one of the points of this report is that rather than just extolling the virtues of East Asia, which is easy to do, you just have to look at the statistics, and it's very easy to do, one has to say, okay, are the next 10 years going to be like the past 10 years? And the answer is definitely not. Yeah. And so that means that governments are going to have to think differently about some of their problems. So issues that you can sweep under the rug in terms of inadequate regulation or incumbents controlling industries or lack of competition or a whole host of things can be hidden when you're growing at 5, 6, 7% a year. Yeah. Okay? But you can't hide these things when you have disruptive technologies, when you have aging populations, when you have trade wars, and when you have the largest economy in the region, and soon, within a decade easily, the largest economy in the world, China, have an expressed policy which sounds very much like import substitution and industrial policy in reaching certain goals in new industries. So this is very challenging, I think, for policymakers in this region because many of them trade extensively with China, and they have to come up with strategies to deal with this new world. So I think the subtext, adapting to new realities, or the report, navigating a changing world, that's what I think this report contributes, which is it's not there to tell East Asia all the wonderful things they've done, because we know that. But if you want to follow Sri Mulyani's hope that East Asia will continue to be the region that everyone will emulate, then I think one has to look at some of the issues that are pending. One has to look at fiscal capacity. One has to look at quality regulation. One has to look at productivity and services. These are things that are going to make a big difference in the next decade.
The role of the government is also something that has been talked about in this report. Now, Bu Mari and also Mr. Lim could probably talk about what has been the biggest problem there. Policy making is a big part, but interestingly, Minister Lim also said that the private sector could play a big role here. It's not saying that the government doesn't take part, but what role that it could play in policy making. What has been the difficulties, especially when we're preparing Indonesia? And if we see from the report, Bu Mari, Indonesia is actually one of the ones that is in a quite bad position in preparing ourselves for the disruptors in the future, and also being the engine of growth in East Asia. Policy making in the government, now that you're out of the government, probably you could talk freer now, I guess.
Well, I think the challenge for policymakers going forward is obviously, as it was in the past, is to how do we continue to do the reforms that are needed. And I do think that the reforms that are needed that we have to do today are actually the more difficult ones. Yeah. You know, like reducing tariffs in the trade in goods kind of space was actually much easier to do than services liberalization or opening up the services sector. Labor issues, which is, I think Indonesia still has to face the issue of labor laws being reformed so that you have reduced the rigidity in the labor market, which is part of the problem of the preparedness for this technological disruption. We have, this is already happening in Indonesia, where labor-intensive factories, making shoes, making garments, they have had to resort to automation, even including already using some robotics because of the rigidity in the labor laws. You know, to the minimum wage that goes up higher than productivity, the difficulties of retrenchment. So the response was partly to do automation and going to robotics. And also because they have to compete with Vietnam and China, right? So that's the reality. And unless you can do reform on your labor market, then we don't even talk about the skill issue and the education issue yet before we can talk more about that. So I think the difficulties that governments face today, and perhaps I'm quite glad I'm not in government now, I can just say the difficulties with having to do it. I think we have a much more challenging situation where the dissatisfaction with the globalization, the increased call for protectionism is much as Mr. Lim, how do you address the issues of the people left behind? How do you deal with the issue of inequality as at the same time you want to do opening up? And I think today we can't just talk about, okay, we have to continue opening up because it's good for us. We have to then at the same time say, okay, we're opening up, but this is going to be the cost, this is going to be the sum of the disruption, and this is what we need to do to address it, right? And the way I think there's two things, I'll close on this. There are two things that challenge policymakers today. It's the narrative. I think the narrative that policymakers who are at the end of the day have to talk the political language. What are we doing to really make your lives better, right? The narrative on trade has to come to that level, because otherwise I think the pushback and the resistance is so much higher now that there is like, I think policymakers at the end of the day get somewhat cold feet when they have to actually push the reforms they know are needed, right? Sri Mulyani actually gave us a speech at another forum where she mentioned this. So you have to say, okay, this is going to create jobs. This is going to make your lives better. Like in services, I would say that's one area where it's definitely going to make your supposedly, if we go to the modern services. The other thing I would say is coordination. As
within the government, you mean?
Within the government, to be able to identify these are the strategic issues, and it is not only the job of the trade minister or the finance minister or of some other technical minister. It has to be done collectively, because as a former trade minister, you know, the easiest policy to turn on and off is trade policy, right? Okay, raise the tariff, raise the protection, and then we can say, okay, we're protecting your interests. It's the easiest one to turn on and off. The hardest ones are the ones that Danny mentioned, you know, under the fiscal realm, where what am I doing to actually have effective policies that make people's lives better? Takes much longer, and you don't know whether it's going to affect you, and you have to go to Parliament to fight for the budget. So how do we actually have better coordination? I think it's still going to be a big challenge. And for a country like Indonesia, it's within government and then central and local government.
So narrative and coordination, but does that mean that the government does know what to do before going to coordinating it and narrating it to the people? I mean, right, you know, I mean, I'd like to think that my government does. Oh, okay, this is not ask the World Bank, is that still is it? But I mean, is it always the case that the government? The problem is how should we narrate this to deliver it the way we want to the people? And the other thing is how should we coordinate it? But I mean, describe to us difficulties when you're within the government. Do you always know what to do, especially when you're facing questions for 10, 15, 20 years ahead?
No, of course not. But you have to, I think I was in another forum today, and someone said, yes, we don't know where this technological disruption is going to take us. We don't know how much climate change is really going to kill all of us if we don't do something, right? We don't know. But but by not knowing and we do nothing, that's worse than taking the risk to do something, right? So I think at the end of the day, of course, we believe in evidence-based policy making and all that, and we should be doing our homework in terms of understanding the issue and understanding the cause of the problem, like inequality or lack of well-being. It's not because of globalization and trade alone, actually it's more because the policies to manage the globalization is
Yeah.
not effective enough or whatever. We have to identify the problem. The problem is not to stop the trade and stop globalization, right?
Yes.
So that kind of discussion needs to happen. But I think we also have to be, as policymakers, you have to be realistic to know how to, I think Mr. Lim is very experienced with this. How do you tell the narrative that perhaps what you do is, okay, we are going to do X. It may be very painful. Trade is always very painful, by the way. Somebody always loses.
Yeah.
So it's always painful. But we know where the pain is, and we directly try to deal where the pain is.
And could give the understanding to.
And I think job creation and reducing some part of the inequality chain, whether it's gender, whether it's a particular region, whether it's a particular sector, is really what the narrative,
All right.
that you understand that, okay, this is going to be painful, and I understand your pain, and I'm trying to do something about your pain.
Okay, political opposition is going to step in right exactly when you're trying to narrate that. So, Minister Lim, narrative and coordination, would you like to add up to more to that, or do you face the same?
I was asking for advice just now.
Yeah.
We had before the quorum started. No, actually, when you talk about policy making, that's sometimes one of the toughest calls. Because even though it may be evidence-based, but you would not know whether this evidence is reliable or not.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, when you have to make a call, we try, of course, in good faith, to make sure that the policies we make is not regressive. And secondly, that it must engender greater competition. It must make us more competitive. And finally, it goes back to what I've said earlier. It must benefit the ordinary people.
Yeah.
If they feel they don't have a stake in it, then things will change. Just as the last government in Malaysia lost elections, not just because of corruption, but because people felt that they were having a more difficult lifestyle, and
they didn't just hear about it, but they lived it.
Yes, and that's why they felt that they have no other choice but to change. So that is very crucial for any government. Now, when I talk about investments, just now you asked about technology. We have no choice but to embrace technology. And to embrace technology, we also need investments. But I think these investments must, of course, going back again to what I said, it must not be regressive. It must engender competition at the end of the day for the local population, and also it must benefit the public at large. Now, how are you able to attract investors when you have such a strict and rigorous? You're putting them on a straitjacket. I think if you can craft policies where it is where you can have clarity, you can have certainty, and you can engender confidence, I think investors will come. At the end of the day, for any economic policy to be successful, you must gain the confidence of the business community. And if you have the confidence of the business community, they will invest. If you don't have, even if the government invests, they will not come in.
How much is the government policy involved in doing that, or would you say it's all about the policies that you make?
Number one, as again, evidence-based. Hopefully, the evidence is reliable, and it must be. There must be clarity. There must be certainty. Business people hate uncertainty and hate opaque government structures, and you must engender confidence that there will be greater prosperity and success.
Okay.
That is not easy to achieve. That's why we need institutions like World Bank to give us some guidance. I'm not saying that World Bank is right all the time.
Okay.
Different situations,
Selected
different
cases.
localities, they will have different requirements. But then again, I think policies which, again, if I just jump over to South Korea, when they wanted the country to move forward, what the government did was to gather all the big business, the chabos together, give them incentives, but they don't run the companies. They let them run with all the incentives, with all the bank loans, with all the grants. And look at what happened to South Korea today. So I think this this supports what I was trying to say just now. That narrative that the government cannot do it alone. The days of government knows best is over.
Okay.
We need collaboration from the private sector, from the professional groups. They are the distinct community, and also from the people. There must be public buy-in.
Okay.
Then only then can this narrative work.
Okay, Mr. Tan, would you differ from that? Probably, especially in the case of Vietnam. But I would also like for you to say about the government policies and how it would affect East Asia in maintaining that growth.
Yeah, I guess, we talk about the importance of reform. The role of the government and the need to collaborate with the private sector. But in the end is the government only acts under pressure. Where does the pressure come from? Right? So if going back to what you call the East Asia model, right? So it was, growth. It was expectation from the population to get out of poverty. The trust in the government, sometimes sacrificing a certain degree of freedom, right? In trust, the leadership, right? To have a pro-growth strategy.
Yeah.
And if you look at even the openness to trade policy, sometimes happen because of that. You get the pressure to reform from your commitment to various free trade agreements.
Okay.
Right? But coming next, where does the pressure come from? And I see the pressure will come more and more from the rising middle class in East Asia. Right? So both the upper middle income countries and the lower middle income countries. Right? The middle class are rising fast.
Yes.
And they demand, it's not just expectation of, job creation or high rate of GDP growth.
It's a whole new set of demands.
Quality growth. And also voice and accountability.
Yes.
Right? So I see that this is an opportunity for the government, right? To be under that kind of pressure from the middle class and to conduct policy. And here comes also the opportunities from advancement in technology. So if you embrace new technology, that actually the government can get feedbacks from the public pressure more accurately, allowing you to make actually more evidence-based public
And
policy.
technology has also provided a medium for that voice to be heard as well, of course. I would like to open this panel also for everyone here. If you would like to ask questions, we have 2 microphones on the left and on the right. We have microphones delivered too as well. Okay. So if you would just state your name, please.
Thank you for the opportunities. My name is Putra Prima. I am from Indonesian Central Bank scholarship awardee, and I'm also from University of Indonesia. So I have a question regarding about the inequality in the East Asia region. In the previous seminars, talking about the Asia as at the forefront, they talk about the growth challenges in Asia as a whole. But it also appears that the inequality may become a problem. And one of the panelists, Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, told us that having new transformation of taxations is needed, since in the Asia region, Asia is still low in promoting proper taxations to promote the wealth equality besides human capital. And since the inequality becomes a problem also in the East Asia, my question is, specifically in East Asia, can this taxations policy be implemented in Asia? And if yes, what kind of tax reform that we needed to promote the wealth equality? And the second one is, we know that there is a trade-off between efficiency for the growth and also with the equality. So in case of East Asia, should we think about the equality problem? How sensitive would it affect the growth of East Asia itself? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Putra Prima, I'd just like to collect another question. So, you sir in the front, yeah, right in the front here. All right, if you would kindly state your name, please.
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Eob Tolina. I'm a minister in charge of national planning for Ethiopia. It's quite interesting to hear from countries that we see as a model discussing about the evolving, changing role of the state. So I would like to hear more from Vietnam and also Malaysia, and what exactly does that mean? This big push, resource mobilization by the state and directing the economy. Are you questioning that, or are you seeing a more collaborative partnership between the private sector and the government, especially for aspiring nations that are not yet, to your level? What would be your key recommendations based on your experience?
All right, thank you very much. So I will be answering the first one. If our panelists would like to talk more about tax reforms and when we're talking about the East Asia transformation, tax reforms, Danny?
Well, I think if I remember the report's analysis, it tends to show not only that the overall tax take is not as robust as it should be, but also that there's less of a reliance on progressive forms of taxation. So I didn't hear Jeff Sachs like you did, but I can imagine that if you look at the tax incidence of a VAT, for example, which is a consumption tax, versus a progressive income tax, one is much more likely to deal with questions of inequality than the other. So I think East Asia has an opportunity, given that it has very high growth rates compared to other regions, to make some adjustment in its fiscal burden, which would be conducive to dealing with inequality issues. On your second question, whether inequality per se is going to lower the growth rate, I think, as the minister from Malaysia said, we have to really look at the political economy. I think there are lessons to be learned from looking at advanced economies for countries that aspire to be higher than middle income and want to be high income. And one of them is that you need to maintain some sort of social consensus that the policies make sense and that they're fair. And I think there's a lot of evidence out there that wealth concentration has increased, and that with wealth concentration comes a limiting of opportunity for people to move up the income distribution. So it's not just a question of whether the poverty level has been escaped. Indonesia is single digit, like the minister said. It's a question of whether or not there is fairness in the system. And I think that can be a drag on growth if some of the political consensus around the kinds of policies that East Asia has pursued ends up being eroded. So that's, I think, apart from what your social position is on inequality, there's a very practical political economy issue, which is that you need the population to be with you when you're undertaking some of the reforms that Mari Pangestu and others have mentioned.
Okay. Would you like to add on to that, Bu Marik?
Let me just answer the question about the trade-off between growth and inequality. I think it doesn't have to be a trade-off. If you understand what is the kind of growth, the quality of growth, or the structure of growth, or the sources of growth that you would like to plan and manage, and that's where there's the role of planning, the role of government, the role of policy reforms, and so on. Because I think if you look at Indonesia's case, the rise in inequality, if you look at some of the studies that have been done, is actually because of the lack of broad-based growth. You know, we had the commodity boom in the last, the inequality went up during the time of the commodity boom because it's only certain regions, certain sectors that benefited from this high growth. And it was also what would you say, some ineffective government policies, such as the fuel subsidy, actually, because the fuel subsidy, which was intended to help the poor, actually ended up not helping the poorer parts of the population. So it had kind of the opposite effect. So when you change from the fuel subsidy to using it more for the equitable programs, then there is some correction. But again, actually, we're having the same argument again now about our fuel subsidy as the oil price is going up. But anyway, so you have to understand where are the sources of the inequality and address it. And I do believe you can address it and still achieve growth, but you need to be able to understand the sources. And if I may just briefly answer the question about what is the role of the state, I would like to agree with the other comments made that the role of the state is definitely now is very different, right? It has to be multi-stakeholder, it's the private sector, it's the civil society, and I agree totally with you. The pressure on the government must come from the will of the people, from middle class. I mean, I don't think China would have joined the climate change accord if it had not been for the dissatisfaction of their own people for the pollution in Beijing, for instance, right? So it's either crisis or pressure to push the reform and this multi-stakeholder approach. And I would say that for a country that's starting just at the beginning, I think laying the foundations is the role of the state, whether it's physical infrastructure or human capital, and obviously institution building, and creating the conducive environment. I don't think states should say, okay, this sector is the one that we should be. Picking winners is no longer, I think, the role of the state. It's more about creating the conducive environment and laying the foundations for investment, for private sector to come in, and so on.
Okay, it'll be interesting also to listen from Vietnam, especially about the role of the state. But I'd like to give both questions to be answered by Minister Lim. First about the trade-off between efficiency of growth versus equality. What your thoughts on that, and also about the role of state when we're talking about controlling the economy. How much? I think we got a picture of your opinion about this, but if you would elaborate more about that.
Well, I think why should there be a trade-off in the first place? If that you have growth but still you have yawning inequality, there's something wrong with that growth. There is not quality growth that we are looking for. So I think that you can still have growth and at the same time work towards reducing the Gini coefficient. But now it's just not about reducing the Gini coefficient. Now the question is whether you can generate higher purchasing power. And that is also equally important. I think just now, Madam Peng has to reply to that gentleman's question on developing countries coming from initial stage. I think for me, I was referring to how to escape the middle income trap. And for me, when you talk about escaping the middle income trap, for governments to invest due to the limited resources available, they don't have enough money to make mistakes. And when you invest, and when government invests, the problems of crowding out, the problems of inefficiency, the problems of wastage and leakages comes in. That's why I mentioned about the PPP, the partnership model with other stakeholders. The other aspect is when you are embracing rapid technological change, the prospects of the government making mistakes and even policy makers making mistakes is so much higher. Because how do you identify winners? And is the government willing to adopt a new mindset where they are willing to accept 10 failures just to be able to choose one winner? You can do that in the marketplace. But for a government, especially for a leader, that would be the surest cut to be fired or sacked by the president. But if we adopt this mindset of public-private collaboration that is run by the private sector, then I think you can at least remove that risk. This is something that I think we are exploring, because we feel if government continues to try to pick up winners, I don't think they'll do a very good job. and it will make it so much harder to escape the middle-income trap.
Okay. Okay, that is the role of the government. Now, Mr. Tan, Vietnam, you could use that as an example, of course, under pressure and what you're facing now. But please do comment first about the first question, about that trade-off. Do you believe that there should be a trade-off?
I think it all depends on how smart you are, right, in making policies.
Okay.
Right? So in the end, so that comes also the role of the state is right now is we talk about smart government and smart policies, right? And then you don't need to have that kind of a trade-off. And that if you look at, I mean, like the question of public finance and the need for tax reform. Of course, you look at the report, you say there's a need to increase revenue as a percentage of GDP. There's a need to move toward more direct taxes so that East Asian countries and many other lower middle income countries, right, can actually now in a position to provide better social services based on higher tax revenue. But then it comes to the need, like also raised in the report, of a new social contract, right? Where, I mean, raising taxes are unpopular. Right? The people will not vote for that if they don't have a new kind of trust in the government. Right? So there's a. I think it's
like the report says, you could not just raise taxes but broaden the tax base.
Yeah.
Would that be a solution, you think?
But even if broaden the tax base, right? Include both closing down loopholes, right? Reducing the unnecessary tax incentives that you provide to various large businesses, right? So whether you can say that so that requires political will to do that.
Okay.
At the same time, you still need to ask many informal businesses that are not yet in the tax base, that are now have to pay taxes.
Okay.
Right? You become formal, you pay taxes. But I will pay taxes, but if I trust that services will be provided by the government based on that revenue.
Now the gentleman wanted to know as well, how's Vietnam facing this, the pressure of opening up more and the demand of the middle class?
Yeah, I think, so here again is the issue of smart government and smart regulation, right? So you talk about so back to the old East Asian model. Actually, there's not explicitly mentioned in the report, but there's a very controversial aspect of the East Asian model was the kind of interventionist industrial policies. People can argue some successes if you look at South Korea or today's China, or especially Singapore. But if you look at other ASEAN countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, right? The kind of state-owned enterprises, government, direct public investment projects replacing the private sector. I mean, massive failure. And that's the lessons we learn now is that's the one you know for sure now is stay away from that.
Okay.
Right? That kind of old style industrialist policy. The next one is then you have the arrival of still the new kind of high-tech manufacturing and even like the sharing economy. So take the example, so this not advanced countries, but even lower middle income countries like Vietnam face the challenge. Now is that with this new kind of sharing economy, new economic activities, right? The private sector doesn't wait for the government's regulation.
Yeah.
Even without regulation, they do, like Uber, like
especially with technology. Yeah.
Second thing, next is actually in the financial sector. Right? Government still struggling with restructuring banks, promoting the development of equity market, but already you have the arrival of fintech. Fintech doesn't wait for your regulations.
Yes.
They just go. But so the challenge from the government is still you work with the private sector in designing new regulations for these new kind of activities. You don't know how to regulate. You actually don't understand these new activities. So you need input from these companies. So it's the challenge is you need to work with them.
All right.
To design new regulation. If you don't work, they will still do it even without regulation. But here's the thing, how do you work with the private sector? It's different from the past cozy relationship with the government and interest groups. Here you work, but being transparent.
Okay.
And then listening to the voice from the people in designing. So it's both, right? The public, the new startup, sharing economy, and the government responding to this kind of challenges, especially regulation.
Okay, and as Mr. Lim said, you can't put it in the government's hands per se, because what do governments alone know about technology? And we need these young startups, those who are more familiar with the technology, to actually learn from them. Now, I guess time is up, but Danny, just very shortly, the soonest threat that we would be seeing in East Asia that should be anticipated first, because we're seeing trade wars, we're seeing what's going on between China and America. What should we be anticipating the soonest?
Well, I think the trade war probably will get worse before it gets better. The question really is, what does that imply for, in my view, China's policy? I think that in order to maintain growth, the People's Bank of China has had to reverse its financial constraints and is now providing ample credit and lowering reserve requirements and doing everything possible to keep the growth rate up. That's not really good macroeconomic or microeconomic management. So I think it's having a negative effect on China. What it will do in the U.S., we don't know yet, but presumably it will push inflation above the magic 2% range, and then it will cause the Fed to tighten up faster or more. All of these things mean that there's greater uncertainty in the global economy. It's harder to be a policymaker now than it was probably 10 years ago. And I think it's an open question whether or not, in terms of China's own Made in China 2025 strategy and its announced goals and its desire to import substitute for some of its intermediate technology products that it gets primarily from Korea, whether or not the trade war will accelerate that. And if it does, it speeds up whatever you think is going to happen in the region because of China's repositioning itself. It's going to speed that up. So I think the answer to your question is one has to look at 2019 and 20 with some anticipation, not necessarily positive anticipation, and that for countries that are facing this, and it's not only the three that are represented on the panel, we have many other countries in East Asia alone. The question is, how do you prepare for the unexpected? How do you build your resilience? How do you improve the functioning of government? How do you cut down on corruption and other things that are robbing you of the fiscal capacity that you need to deal with some of the issues that I mentioned before? So I just think it speeds things up. I think we're in an uncertain world in which policy making is more difficult and in which countries need to be prepared for some outcomes that we can't predict.
Okay, so much to learn, but there's no time to learn anymore. So action needs to be taken. Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you very much for your time. Ibu Mari, terima kasih banyak. Please do a round of applause. Mr. Lim, thank you very much. I'd like to close also, Mr. Tan, thank you very much, by inviting the World Bank Vice President, Victoria Kwakwa, to give her closing remarks. Please welcome Victoria Kwakwa.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank our distinguished panelists, Minister Lim, Dr. Pangestu, Professor Leisiger, Dr. Tan, and thank you also, Tim, for moderating so excellently this panel. I think, and also with the comments of Sri Mulyani at the beginning, thanks to her as well. And thanks to all of you for being here. Marie said when she got on the stage that it's freezing cold, and it is very cold, but several of you are still here over an hour. So thank you for braving the cold and staying on. It shows the interest that you have in this very important topic, Resurgent East Asia. So we've had a very rich conversation. I'm not going to try and summarize the conversation. We've heard about the uncertainties going forward. Certainly what has worked in the past might not necessarily work going forward. Things needing to be tweaked. We've heard about the important role that the government has to continue to play and what that role is, getting that right role. The government can't do it alone. The private sector is needed. A new model where there's collaboration between the different stakeholders, the government, the private sector, civil society, and using deepening trade integration arrangements to deepen reform and to move forward the pressure of the rising middle class that will bring change. And so all of these are relevant to the topic that we're discussing. But in closing, let me try and summarize a little bit some of what we have in the report, which we have hard copies of here, just the overview. And share with you a little bit and hope that you get a chance to read it and the full report when it's ready. So let's start with where the session began. We've all acknowledged East Asia's success over the past half-century, which has been really remarkable, both in terms of sustained economic growth and poverty reduction. This is often referred to as developing East Asia. What is referred to as developing East Asia is now squarely a middle-income region. And we know that this success was built on a combination of policies that fostered outward orientation, labor-intensive growth, while investing in basic human capital and good economic governance. But we also know that as countries develop and the world changes, we need to consider whether this model is up to the task ahead, or if some adaptation is needed to support countries' transition from middle to high income status. Several forces are increasing the urgency for reforms to ensure that countries in the region can meet their aspirations of achieving high income status. We've talked about productivity growth, which has been slowing, as in much of the rest of the world. The changes in global trade, which is slowing. Technology changing rapidly, creating new opportunities and presenting some challenges as well. And also the rising expectations of the middle class, as I mentioned. So this report gives some suggestions of how countries in East Asia can adapt to these changes and continue to be prosperous going forward. Specifically, the report looks at a five-pronged approach to continuing to make progress in East Asia. Building skills. And looking at this, we're talking about beyond a focus on basic human capital, it's also going to be increasingly important for countries to support development of higher education or higher order skills, including socio-emotional skills and digital literacy. Fostering inclusion, the countries will need to put in place strong policies to promote inclusion, not only with traditional social protection programs, but programs to support vulnerable workers as they make inevitable economic transitions. Making digital technologies broadly accessible and affordable is also an important part of the inclusion agenda. Then strengthening state institutions. Countries will need to increase state effectiveness as the constellation of needed policies becomes more complex and a growing middle class demands more and better services. Increasing transparency and enhancing accountability will be key. We also heard Minister Lim put on the the table, the issue of fighting corruption. And then financing the transition to high income. Government will need to find ways to finance these more ambitious policy agendas. Increasing domestic revenue mobilization will require countries to expand their tax bases, reduce tax competition, including through regional cooperation, simplify tax codes, and strengthen tax administrations. So I urge you to take a copy of the overview report and to stay tuned for the fuller report, which will be launched in the region in the next couple of months. I want to thank you all again for being here and to wish all our countries in East Asia success in navigating and adapting to the new realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And that concludes our event today. Once again, a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much, Minister Lim. Thank you very much, Mr. Tan. Buwari, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.